When we think about biology, we tend to admire efficiency. The fastest predators, bacteria that can replicate in minutes, systems that just work.
Right.
But today, we're looking at a group of killers that, well, they start with this massive disadvantage. They're slow, they're cumbersome, and they basically show up to the crime scene without their weapons loaded.
That is a great way to frame it. It's a total biological paradox. We're talking about the negative-strand RNA viruses.
Right. And digging into our source material, that's chapter 29 of Lippincott Illustrated Reviews, microbiology, it really seems like this group shouldn't even be a threat. I mean, they get into a cell with a set of instructions the cell literally cannot read.
It's gibberish to the host.
Exactly. And yet, this family includes rabies, Ebola, measles, the flu. I mean, some of the most lethal pathogens in human history.
It is fascinating, isn't it? They start with this handicap, but they've evolved a very, very specific workaround that makes them incredibly dangerous. So our mission today is really to decode that workaround. We need to get into why being negative matters so much for how they replicate. And then we're going to trace their path of destruction from, the bullet-shaped rhabdovirus to the shape-shifting influenza.
Before we jump into shapes and symptoms, let's just nail down this negative concept. When I hear negative-strand RNA, my brain immediately goes to photography. Like an old-school film negative.
That's actually the perfect analogy to use. Think about a film negative. It has all the information for the photo, right?
Yeah.
The image is there.
Right.
But if you hold it up, the colors are all wrong. They're inverted. You can't just put that negative in a picture frame. It's useless by itself.
You have to develop it first. You need that process to turn the negative into the positive, into the actual picture.
Exactly. And in biological terms, a positive strand, virus like polio, which we've talked about before, it's like a digital photo. It's ready to go. The second it enters the cell's ribosomes, which are kind of like the cell's 3D printers, they see it and go, oh, great, instructions. Let's start building.
But our negative strand guys today,
They walk in the door holding the film negative. They hand it to the ribosome, and the ribosome just says, I don't speak this language. It just ignores it. The genomic RNA is not infectious on its own.
So you could just inject that naked RNA into a cell.
And nothing would happen? Absolutely nothing.
So
Yeah.
if the cell can't read the negative and the virus can't use the cell's machinery, how does it not just, die out right there?
It brings its own darkroom. That is the crucial mechanism you have to remember. Every single one of these negative strain viruses, they're enveloped, and tucked inside that envelope, right next to their genetic material, they carry their own special enzyme. It's called an RNA-dependent RNA polymerase.
Okay, that's a mouthful. RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. Let's break that down.
Think of it like a translator, or the developer fluid. Since the host cell doesn't have an enzyme that can read negative RNA, the virus has to pack its own. It's like a contractor showing up to a job site where the outlets don't fit his power tools, so he brings his own generator.
I get it. So this polymerase, it reads the negative strand.
And it transcribes it and makes a copy into a positive strand, a messenger RNA.
And once that positive strand exists,
Then the cell's machinery wakes up. Oh, okay, now I see the instructions.
Yeah.
And it starts churning out viral proteins. But the key takeaway, the thing students really need to lock in, is that the virus must bring that polymerase with it. If it forgets to pack that enzyme, it is game over.
that's a pretty high-stakes strategy. You have to travel with all your own equipment.
Right.
Okay, so we've got the mechanism. Negative means you bring a polymerase. Now let's look at the lineup. The source material kicks off with one of the most visually distinctive viruses in the book, the Rhabdoviridae.
Right, specifically the genus lysovirus, which is what gives us rabies.
And visually, this thing is terrifying. I'm looking at the electron micrograph in figure 29.2 right now. It doesn't look like a sphere or a blob. It looks like a bullet.
A perfect bullet shape. It's a helical nucleocapsid all wrapped in an envelope. And that shape is so appropriate because this virus really acts like a slow-moving projectile aimed right at the brain.
Epidemiologically, we all think of the classic trope, right? The foaming dog.
Which is still true in many developing countries. Dogs are the main reservoir. But the text makes a good point that in the U.S., that profile has shifted. Now we're looking at wildlife. Raccoons, skunks, foxes.
And bats.
Bats are a huge one. And the scary thing with bat bites is they can be tiny. You might not even know you've been bitten.
So let's trace the path of this bullet. Because rabies is so unique, it isn't like the flu where you breathe it in and boom, you're sick in 2 days. This is a a slow burn.
It's a journey. So the virus gets in through the bite, usually into muscle tissue. It might replicate there for a bit, keeping a low profile. But it's looking for something. It's hunting for a peripheral nerve ending.
It's trying to find the wiring.
Exactly. Once it gets into that nerve, it undergoes what's called retrograde transport.
Retrograde. So it's moving backwards.
Against the normal flow. Usually, signals travel from the brain down to the limb. This virus climbs up the nerve axon, using it like a ladder, moving toward the central nervous system. It physically travels up the arm or leg, hits the spinal cord, and finally gets to the gray matter of the brain.
And that travel time explains the really long incubation period, right?
Yes. If you get bitten on your toe, that virus has a long commute to the brain. Incubation could take months. Get bitten on the face, it's a much shorter trip. Weeks, maybe.
That is just horrifying. It is literally crawling up your nervous system. And once it hits the brain, that's when the chaos starts. It spreads to the autonomic nerves, and this is crucial back out to the salivary glands, which completes the cycle. It connects the brain to the mouth so it can pass to the next victim.
Precisely. And this is where we see those symptoms that make rabies the stuff of nightmares. Hallucinations, seizures, agitation, and the most famous one, hydrophobia.
Fear of water. I've always found this so baffling. Is it psychological? Like, do they just look at a glass of water and feel terror?
It's actually physiological, which I think is almost worse. It's not a mental phobia. The infection causes these violent, agonizing spasms in the pharyngeal muscles, your throat, anytime the patient tries to swallow.
So it's not that they hate water. It's that their body physically rejects the act of swallowing it.
Right. So eventually just the sight or even the suggestion of water triggers this anticipation of pain. They start avoiding liquids entirely, even while they're dying of dehydration. It's a brutal but effective mechanism.
So if we're playing detective post-mortem, is there a smoking gun? How do you know for sure it was rabies?
You look at the brain cells, specifically in the hippocampus. You're looking for what are called Negri bodies. If you look at figure 29.4 in the text.
Negri body.
They're these eosinophilic, so they stain pinkish red blobs in the cytoplasm of the neuron. That pink blob is basically the viral factory. You see Negri bodies, it is a definitive diagnosis.
And sadly, if you're seeing them, the patient is already gone. Rabies is effectively 100% fatal when symptoms show up.
It is. Which brings us to the only hope we have. That window of opportunity. Because the virus has to physically climb that nerve ladder, we have time. If you think you've been exposed, you rush to the ER for post-exposure prophylaxis.
This is the protocol the text lays out. It's a two-pronged attack.
Right. First is passive immunization. We inject anti-rabies immunoglobulin, these are pre-made antibodies, right into and around the wound site. That's to neutralize the virus immediately, right at the door.
Like calling it a SWAT team before the burglar even gets in the house.
And second, active immunization. We give the vaccine, but at a different site. This teaches your own immune system how to make its own antibodies. The goal is to train your body to intercept the virus before it can reach the brain. It's a race.
A literal race between the vaccine and the virus. That is incredibly tense.
Oh.
Okay, let's leave the solitary assassin of rabies and move to a family that operates more like a mob, the Paramyxoviridae.
A very crowded family. Structurally, we're shifting from that bullet shape to just a sphere, but the real signature here is on the surface. These viruses are covered in spikes. And
for anyone trying to keep these straight, the text highlights two key proteins, HN and F.
Right. HN stands for hemagglutinin neuraminidase. Think of those as the grappling hooks. They help the virus stick to the host cell. But that F protein, that's the one you really need to watch.
F for fusion.
Yep. The F protein lets the virus enter the cell, but it's messy. It works so well that it actually causes the infected host cell to fuse with its neighbor, and then that cell fuses with the next one, and so on.
So instead of individual cells, you end up with what?
You get these giant multinucleated blobs called syncytia.
Syncytial.
This is a hallmark of this family. If you look at a tissue sample and you see a massive cell with like 10 nuclei all mashed together, you know the F protein has been at work.
It's basically throwing the tissue into a zombie mashup.
Okay.
Let's run through the clinical roster here, because these are names everyone knows. First up, parainfluenza.
This is mainly a pediatric thing. Types 1 and 3 are the classic cause of croup.
That's the seal bark cough.
Exactly. It causes swelling in the upper airway, the larynx and trachea. When the kid breathes in, you hear that stridor, and when they cough, it sounds just like a barking seal. It's terrifying for parents, but usually manageable.
Then we have mumps. I feel like mumps is the forgotten sibling in this family, but it has some really distinct features.
It does. Mumps is a rubeola virus, And the classic presentation is parotitis, that swelling of the parotid and salivary glands. It gives the patient that classic chipmunk cheek look you see in figure 29.6.
But mumps doesn't just stay in the cheeks, it travels.
Oh yeah, it spreads systemically. It can hit the pancreas, the CNS, and famously the testes. That's called orchitis.
And that's the one people always warn about with fertility.
It's a legitimate concern. In postpubertal males, severe inflammation of the testes can lead to testicular atrophy, and in some rare cases, sterility. That's why that MMR vaccine is so critical.
Speaking of the MMR, let's hit the big one. The first M, measles, or morbillivirus.
Measles is a beast. It's one of the most contagious viruses known to man. I mean, if one person has it in a room, basically everyone in that room without immunity is going to get it.
The text breaks down the symptoms into a specific timeline. It starts with the 3 C's.
Cough, coryza, and conjunctivitis. Coryza is just the medical term for a runny nose. So you're miserable, coughing with red, watery eyes. And then you get the warning sign.
This is another visual diagnostic. Looking at figure 29.7, it's inside the mouth.
Koplik spots. These are crucial. They appear on the bright red mucosa inside the cheek, and they look like little grains of salt or white sand. They show up a day or two before the rash, so if you see the salt, you know what's coming.
And what's coming is the rash.
A maculopapular rash. It starts at the hairline behind the ears and just spreads downward like someone's pouring it over you, head to feet.
Now, most kids recover, but measles has a really dark side. The text mentions post-infectious encephalomyelitis.
Yeah, that's an autoimmune disaster. About 2 weeks after the rash, the immune system gets confused and starts attacking the myelin sheath on your nerves. But there's an even scarier long-term complication called SSPE, subacute sclerosing panencephalitis.
That's the one that happens years later.
Years later. A defective form of the virus just lingers in the brain and slowly destroys it. It's always fatal. It's rare, thank God. But it really underscores that measles isn't just a harmless childhood rite of passage.
Absolutely not. And before we leave this family, one more. RSV, respiratory syncytial virus.
The scourge of every NICU and pediatric ward. It's the #1 cause of bronchiolitis and pneumonia in infants under a year old.
And does the name syncytial imply what I think it implies?
It does. It has that F protein. It forms those syncytia blobs in the lungs, which causes inflammation and mucus plugging. And for a tiny baby airway, that is incredibly dangerous.
Okay, let's shift gears. We've done the bullet, we've done the sticky blobs. Now we're at the heavyweight champion of global misery, the Orthomyxoviridae.
Or, as everyone knows it, influenza.
This virus just seems to delight in breaking rules. We said earlier that negative-strand viruses replicate in the cytoplasm, but flu.
Flu has to be special. Influenza goes into the cell and heads straight for the VIP section, the nucleus. It actually replicates its RNA inside the host's nucleus, which is highly unusual for an RNA virus.
And while it's in there, it pulls off a heist called cap snatching. I love this name. It sounds like petty theft.
It's actually really sophisticated molecular piracy. So to start making its own messenger RNA, the virus needs a cap, a chemical structure that's like a key to start translation. But instead of making its own, the viral polymerase finds a host, mRNA.
A message the cell was just trying to send to itself.
And it just cuts the head off. It snatches the 5' cap from the host's message and welds it onto its own viral RNA.
So it decapitates the host's instructions to jumpstart its own. That's brutal.
It's incredibly effective. But the real genius of influenza, the reason we're still dealing with it every single winter, is its genome structure.
It's segmented.
Correct. Unlike measles or rabies, which have one long strand of RNA, influenza has 8 separate segments. You can think of it like a deck of cards or maybe chapters in a loose leaf binder.
And this structure is the key to that whole drift versus shift problem.
Precisely. So first you have antigenic drift. This happens in both flu A and flu B. The virus is sloppy when it replicates. It makes little typos.
So the H&N spikes, the hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, they change just a little bit.
Right. It puts on a fake mustache. Your immune system still recognizes it, but it might take a second longer. This is why we need a new flu shot every year to update our wanted posters. That's what causes seasonal epidemics.
But then there's antigenic shift. This is the catastrophic one.
This is the pandemic maker. It only happens in influenza A, and it relies entirely on that segmented genome.
Okay, so walk us through the mechanism. How does a shift actually happen?
Okay, imagine a farm. You have a pig. Now, pigs are the perfect mixing vessel because they have receptors for both human flu viruses and avian bird flu viruses.
So a pig can get bird flu and human flu at the same time.
at the exact same time. So one single cell in that pig's lung gets infected by 2 different viruses. Both viruses uncoat and dump their 8 segments into the nucleus. Now you have 16 RNA segments floating around.
It's like shuffling 2 decks of cards together.
Exactly. And when the new baby viruses are being assembled, they just grab 8 segments at random. They might take 7 segments from the human virus, so it knows how to infect people, but it grabs the hemagglutinin segment from the bird virus.
A bird spike on a human virus body.
Exactly. This is reassortment, and when this new Frankenstein virus bursts out, it meets a human population whose immune systems have never seen that bird spike before. There's no recognition, no protection.
And that's 1918. That's H1N1. That's a pandemic.
That's a pandemic. The entire population is immunologically naive to the new threat.
It's terrifyingly elegant. Just a simple shuffle of the deck. Now, we do have drugs like Tamiflu or oseltamivir. How do they work?
They target the N spike, the neuraminidase.
Oh, what does neuraminidase actually do?
Its job is to be the scissors. When new viruses are budding off the cell, they're kind of stuck to the surface. Neuraminidase cuts that tether so the virus can fly off and infect the next cell.
So Tamiflu just gums up the scissors.
Exactly. It inhibits the enzyme. The viruses get made, but they can't leave. They just clump up on the surface of the cell and die there. But you have to take it early, usually within 48 hours, for it to be really effective.
Got it. Okay, we're in the home stretch. We just need to cover the dangerous and exotic section. These are the ones that sound like science fiction.
The filoviruses, bunyaviruses, and arenaviruses.
Let's start with Filoviridae, Ebola and Marburg. Visually, these are very distinct.
Very. Philo means thread. If you look at figure 29.11, they look like these long, twisted filaments. Sometimes they even curve at the top like a shepherd's crook.
It almost looks like a worm. And clinically.
Severe hemorrhagic fever. They attack the endothelial cells, the lining of your blood vessels. This leads to vascular leak, shock, and widespread bleeding. The mortality rates are just staggering.
Then we've got the Bunyaviridae. This includes hantavirus. Now, hantavirus breaks the transmission pattern we've seen.
Right. Most of these exotics are arboviruses. They're transmitted by arthropods, by bugs. But hantavirus is rodent-borne, specifically deer mice.
And you don't even have to be bitten.
No. It's in the urine and the droppings. If that dries up in a dusty shed or a cabin and you go in and sweep it up, you inhale the aerosolized virus. It causes hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. Your lungs basically fill with fluid.
Note to self, wear a mask when cleaning the garage. Okay, finally, the Arenaviridae, Lassa fever.
Lassa is an arenavirus. The name comes from the Latin arena, which means sand.
Sand. Why sand?
It's a visual thing. Under an electron microscope, the virus looks kind of grainy or sandy, and that's because these viruses are sloppy packers. When they assemble, they accidentally package the host cell's ribosomes inside the new virus particle.
So the sand is actually stolen furniture from the host cell.
That's a great way to put it. The ribosomes are non-functional for the virus. It's just junk it carried along, but it gives them that signature look.
Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground.
Sure.
From the slow climb of rabies to the rapid shuffle of influenza. If you had to boil this all down for the listener, the high-yield summary, what are the key takeaways?
All right, here's the cheat sheet. Number 1, the mechanism. Negative-strand viruses have a negative genome. It can't be read by the cell, so they must carry their own RNA-dependent RNA polymerase to get started.
Okay.
Number 2, rabies. Think bullet shape and retrograde transport. It climbs the nerves and look for Negri bodies in the brain.
Got it.
Number 3, paramyxo. Think fusion. The F protein creates syncytia, those giant cells. Measles gives you the 3Cs and Koplik spots. Mumps hits the parotids and the testes.
Right.
And number 4, influenza. Think change. It has a segmented genome that allows for reassortment or antigenic shift inside a mixing vessel like a pig. That's what leads to pandemic.
Boom. That's the code. It really changes how you view a simple sneeze or a bat flying overhead.
It certainly makes you respect the sheer complexity of these microscopic machines.
It does. And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We talked about how the flu virus shuffles its genetic deck to create a pandemic strain.
Yeah.
It's just 8 strands of RNA swapping places in a farm animal. If a random biological card game in a pig can bring our entire civilization to a standstill like it did in 1918, what does that tell us about the fragility of our dominance? We build cities and economies, but biologically we're always just one bad hand of genetic poker away from a global reset.
Sobering thought to end on.
Thanks for diving in with us. Stay curious, wash your hands, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.